I'm going to talk about the last 8 years of freshwater fish research at the SAFE project and how land use change, drought, riparian reserves have affected fish communities and how they're available as a resource to local people. So as I'm sure everyone is aware, land use change is one of the biggest threats to freshwater ecosystems, and you can see just from these 3 pictures of 3 different streams across the SAFE project land area, how different these are abiotically. So you go from your primary rainforest with sort of highly shaded, clear water, mixed substrate and lots of leaf litter, and increasing in sort of sedimentation, turbidity, temperature, and so on. So just to give you an idea of what that land use change does for freshwater ecosystems. So we obviously chose freshwater fish to look at the impacts of land use change on freshwater ecosystems. They're highly diverse and have really high rates of endemism in Borneo. They occupy lots of different functional niches and have been widely used as bioindicators for water quality and ecosystem health around the world. And crucially for me, they're easy to catch or relatively easy to catch and ID in the field, and you can do mark recapture studies to answer different questions as well. So we sampled up to 40 streams across the land use area at the SAFE project and mainly split these into 5 different land use types. So primary rainforest, 2 different types of logged forest, either twice selectively logged or 3 times logged forest, where the last round was salvage logged, and lots of oil palm plantation streams with and without riparian reserves. So to answer different questions as well, we used 2 different sampling protocols. So the first one was exhaustive sampling of 100-meter transects to be able to look at differences in communities across a land use gradient or with riparian reserves. So this involved using multipass electrofishing, cast netting, and tray netting. And then also to look at differences in biomass and availability of fish as a resource to local people, we used cast net only data, which is the dominant technique used by local people in this area, and a mark recapture study, so sampling for 4 to 6 consecutive days at each stream in each year, and also collected loads of different environmental variables to be able to work out what was going on. So in total, we got more than 18,000 fish captures of 39 different species and 1 new species, which is Raspora pycnophysa, which we described last year. So how does land use change actually affect freshwater fish communities? We saw that with any disturbance from primary rainforest, there was a significant loss in species richness and functional richness, which, I mean, you expect primary rainforest to be your reference point, but what I didn't expect was that there would be no difference between logged forest streams and oil palm plantation streams, no difference in the type of logging, so whether it's selectively logged or salvage logged forests in the catchment surrounding the streams. And there was also no significant difference between oil palm streams with a riparian reserve of around 30 meters for these ones and no riparian reserve. So it sort of led me to question more, what is it about the riparian reserve that we need to look at, or is 30 meters just not wide enough in this area? So with all the different environmental variables we measured, we put them into an ordination with the fish community. And these 5 variables, sand, gravel, bedrock, leaf litter, and average depth, all came out as significant in explaining differences in the fish communities. And when these were modeled with species richness, with increasing levels of leaf litter cover and gravel substrate, we saw increasing levels of species richness as well. And this is sort of usually because fish spawn in gravel substrates, and they can use leaf litter as cover and protection or a source of macroinvertebrate prey. So we know there's this big difference across the land use gradient, but how does this actually affect people that live in these areas? Anyone that's been to, I think, Sabah or specifically the SAFE project knows everyone there that we work with always wants to be fishing, or everyone eats fish, so it's definitely a very useful resource to them, whether they're fishing for food directly or to sell food to markets. But interestingly, using only cast netting, which was the main technique they used to catch fish, we saw no difference in species richness here, and crucially, no difference in the biomass of the resource available to local people. And I think that's kind of really interesting for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, here we see no difference in species richness. So if you're going to involve local communities in conservation, how can we expect them to sort of protect different species or be interested in protecting freshwater ecosystems when they might not see any difference unless they're only targeting certain species? And crucially, the resource is maintained across the land use gradient, even though I'd assumed there'd be different levels of offtake and higher levels of fishing in the oil palm plantation, for example. So moving on, I also wanted to look at how the El Nino drought in 2015 and 16 interacted with land use change, and assumed that the drought the impacts of the drought would be more exacerbated in more degraded ecosystems. And you can see that during the drought, the streams essentially dried to a series of disconnected pools, so sort of concentrating all the species into a much smaller area. And okay, I was going to go on to something different then. So we did this using only one species, where we had enough recaptures in the mark recapture model to be able to run spatially explicit models to determine density. And I can't press the buttons. So the table here shows just how different the environmental variables were, sort of before, during, and after the drought. So looking first at the temperature, you can see that in 2016, the middle row for each land use type, the temperature is significantly higher. And during oil palm in the drought, that temperature is up to 6 degrees higher than a sort of usual rainforest stream, which is much higher than most climate change projections for freshwater ecosystems. And sort of, I'm amazed that the fish can cope with those conditions. And then similarly, dissolved oxygen is much lower during the drought. So how did the fish actually cope with this? Essentially, there was no effect of the drought on density of everetti. However, density was affected by the land use. So logged forest was significantly lower than primary forest or oil palm plantations. But the drought did affect the catchability of the fish. So this is only using the cast netting data as well. So the actual captured biomass, what we got within the cast net, was significantly lower during and after the drought. However, when we looked at the predicted biomass based on the density from the mark recapture models, we saw no difference in how much biomass was actually within the stream, suggesting that the fish just become much harder to catch, which may have a relevance for the human communities that might use this as a resource. And so we know that, moving on to the final question, we know that land use has a big impact on freshwater ecosystems. So how can we actually protect freshwater ecosystems further? Riparian reserves are the default conservation tool to do this, and we've already heard quite a bit about them already. And lots of other studies have looked at the presence or absence of riparian reserves and showed that riparian reserves are beneficial. But I wanted to look at what is it actually about the riparian reserve, sort of what qualities of the riparian reserve did you need to have to protect freshwater fish. So I looked at the riparian width, the vegetation or forest quality within the riparian habitat, and the time since disturbance, so when oil palm was planted nearby or when was the last round of logging. And we did this at 34 different streams and used regression trees to determine the threshold values. And firstly, looking at the community metrics, we show that all three variables, forest quality, time, and width, show some way of explaining the differences in the fish community. However, it was forest quality that most often came out in explaining differences, but with no real clear threshold. So forest qualities of 2 and 3, which equates to sort of logged forest streams, had the lowest species richness, but functional richness increased with higher quality streams. But there were clear thresholds for width and time. So with streams of more than 35 meters wide, you had higher abundances of different species, and time of sort of more than 6 years since disturbance, you also seem to have higher abundances. So there's definitely something we need to look into further and the sort of mechanisms behind that as well. And then to summarize, land use change has a huge impact on the freshwater fish communities with any disturbance, which is quite different to what you see terrestrially, where logged forests seem to maintain high levels of diversity. But in freshwater ecosystems, there seems to be primarily a loss of Bornean endemics, 3 of which are shown here. Logging is as negative in this area as conversion was for the freshwater diversity. I think it will be really important to keep the local community involved with freshwater fish research, because they might be impacting and fishing in all the different areas. And although we showed that Everetti was fairly resilient to both drought and land use change, it was the only species I could model doing that, and it's probably the rare and sort of endangered species that are the most impacted, so more research is needed to that. And I advocate riparian reserves of high forest quality and more than 35 metres wide on either side. So a few different implications for management, quite similar to what I've already said. Ideally, start protecting freshwater ecosystems much earlier in the process, so also during logging and deforestation. Maintain existing riparian buffers where possible, restore them where they have been lost. And hopefully this data can feed into RSPO legislation. And I think it'll also be important to look at other strategies for protecting freshwater ecosystems, sort of reduced impact logging, planting in steep areas and stuff like that. And I'm also involved in 2 other projects using stable isotope analysis to look at trophic shifts in the fish communities across the land use gradient. So if you're interested in that, ask me later. Thank you very much.